Hey kids, this is chapter 7 of the evolution of dialectical materialism, philosophical and sociological approach or analysis. I can't remember which one it is, but it doesn't matter. I think it's analysis actually. This is chapter 7, and chapter 7 is titled The Dialectical Materialism of Lenin. Plekhanov can justly be described as a revisionist of Engels' dialectical materialism because Plekhanov introduced some specific philosophical changes into the original doctrine. Plekhanov eliminated Engels' absolute materialism, that is, the proposition, quote, only matter exists, end quote, and made genetic materialism the cornerstone of the whole structure, thus preparing the ground for the rejection of the metaphysical definition of matter in favor of matter's epistemological definition. Further, Plekhanov reduced the negation of the negation to the law of the interpenetration of opposites and changed Engels' order of the two remaining laws of dialectics. This last alteration is not as insignificant as it may perhaps appear, for it intensified the conflict between dialectics and formal logic. Practically all of Plekhanov's revisions of dialectical materialism appear again in Lenin. Lenin not only accepted Plekhanov's amendments to Engels, but pushed Plekhanov's amendments to Engels even further, to a point which makes it possible to speak of Engels and Lenin's dialectical materialism as two distinct doctrines, differing from each other in some important respects. Lenin's revisions of Engels' dialectical materialism were accomplished under the guise of defending Engels' original views from misrepresentation by would-be supporters. Lenin accused the Russian Marxians of having misunderstood or discarded Engels' fundamental ideas, but the whole of materialism and imperial criticism was an attempt to substitute a revised and amended doctrine for Engels' dialectical materialism. Lenin's technique should not have misled anybody familiar with his writings. While expounding Marx or Engels in Lenin's unmistakable way, Lenin was invariably convinced that his interpretation of Marx and Engels' teaching was never anything but a straightforward account of Marx and Engels' views, that anyone who took the trouble to become acquainted with the original sources ought to have seen that Lenin merely restored the true doctrines of Marx and Engels in the doctrines of Marx and Engels' undistorted form. As John Plemannatz so aptly put it, quote, Lenin imagined himself the servant of an infallible doctrine which Lenin alone could interpret, and so could afford to be always modest and yet always right. Quote, it is not I, but Marx, end quote. Or, quote, it is not I, but Engels who says, end quote. These are the unseen beginnings of all his arguments, and the perpetual conclusion, quote, and therefore I am right, end quote, end quote. Footnote, that's from John Plemannatz's German Marxism and Russian Communism. End footnote. Although Plekhanov accused Lenin of revisionism because Lenin's voluntaristic interpretation struck, quote, at the roots of the philosophical, sociological, and economic doctrines of Marx and Engels, end quote, this evaluation has been rejected not only in the Soviet Union, which is understandable, but also by implication in the Western world, where as a rule, the views of Marx and Engels are interpreted in Leninist terms. Lenin, then, not only denied any suggestion that Lenin ever revised the general philosophical foundation of the doctrines of either Marx or Engels. Indeed, according to Lenin's definition of the term, Lenin was not a revisionist. In Lenin's view, amendments to Marx and Engels constituted revisionism only when they represented a, quote, trend hostile to Marxism within Marxism, end quote. That is, contained implications allegedly unfavorable to the interests of the working class. Footnote. Lenin's Marxism and Revisionism, and his piece, How Plekhanov and Co. Defend Revisionism, in Lenin's collected works. Although Lenin conceded that he elaborated upon the work of Marx and Engels, to Lenin this was not revisionism. If the social and political situation changed sharply, changes in doctrine were bound to follow in its wake. Moreover, the advance of knowledge brought new facts and new methods of inquiry. To me. Where am I? Although we can see that he elaborated upon the work of Marx and Engels, to him this was not revisionism. If the social and political situation changed sharply, changes in doctrine were bound to follow in its wake. Moreover, the advance of knowledge brought new facts and new methods of inquiry, and they should be utilized for the development of, quote, Marxism, end quote. Marx's theory was not the last word of science, but a living doctrine, and this implied that it was never, quote, something completed and inviolable, end quote. When pressed hard, Lenin used to say that, quote, Marxist theory, has only laid the cornerstone of the science which socialists must further advance in all directions, if socialists wish to keep pace with life, end quote. That's from Lenin, Our Program. See Lenin's footnote. See Lenin's review of Karl Kautsky's book, Bernstein und das Sozialdemokratische Programm einer Antikritik, and certain features of the historical development of Marxism. Section 1. Epistemological Materialism. Lenin associated the philosophy of Marx with dialectical materialism even more closely than did Plekhanov, and succeeded in establishing the philosophy of Marx and dialectical materialism's identity with each other as an obligatory tenet of Soviet philosophy. This tenet of the identity of dialectical materialism and the philosophy of Marx is still binding today. Lenin also ascribed the introduction of the term, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, to Marx and Engels, and never had any doubt that the doctrine itself was their, Marx and Engels, common property. Footnote. See, for example, Lenin's piece, The Attitude of the Workers' Party Towards Religion. End footnote. Lenin took it for granted that Marx and Engels shared all their views and thus never felt any hesitation in presenting as Marx's opinion what may be ascribed to Engels alone. It has rightly been emphasized that Lenin saw Marx exclusively through Engels' eyes. Consequently, dialectical materialism has become the most fundamental part of what Lenin called the, quote, philosophy of Marxism, end quote, which Lenin conceived as the sum total of the views to be found either in Marx or in Engels. Footnote. See Lenin's 10 Questions to a Lecturer, his The Attitude of the Workers' Party Toward Religion, his Differences in the European Labor Movement, and his 25th anniversary of the death of Joseph Dietzgen. End footnote. Lenin accepted the thesis of genetic materialism, nature is primary and spirit secondary, and traced the thesis of genetic materialism back to the thesis of genetic materialism's origin in Ludwig Feuerbach. Lenin accepted the thesis of whereas for Plekhanov, genetic materialism expressed the most general meaning which the term, quote, materialism could have, for Lenin, genetic materialism became materialism's only philosophically legitimate meaning. This view of Lenin has also prevailed in Soviet philosophy to the present. Having secured the support of Engels' authority, Lenin reformulated genetic materialism in terms of the ontological priority of nature over spirit, matter over mind, body over consciousness, brain over thought, the nervous system over sensation. Lenin also suggested that historical materialism was a particular statement of genetic materialism. 4. Historical materialism asserted the priority of social being over social consciousness, or of the development of productive forces over the development of human society. Similarly, if sensation, thought, and consciousness are the product of matter, it follows that physical objects are primary and the sensation is secondary, and consciousness or thought, being a function of the brain, is a reflection of the external world. Moreover, if sensation depends on matter, which is organized in a definite way, and matter does not depend on sensation, the proposition, quote, matter is primary, end quote, is inferentially equivalent to the proposition, quote, matter acting upon our sense organ produces sensation, end quote. Lenin. These spurious deductions prepare the ground for elimination of the metaphysical concept of matter and the metaphysical concept of matter's replacement by the concept of matter defined in purely epistemological terms. Lenin referred to Engels' absolute materialism, quote, the unity of the world consists in the world's materiality, end quote, as the, quote, most elementary proposition of materialism, end quote, but suggests that, quote, materiality, end quote, means simply the, quote, objective reality which exists outside us, end quote. For, quote, matter, end quote, and, quote, objective reality, end quote, were synonymous expressions.
We're leaving the door open for the doggies so they can not alone.
Dogs. In other words, Lenin reduced some absolute materialism to epistemological realism. Okay, I'll see you guys. Dogs.
Eddie and Basil, come. Go see Tom. Go see Tom. What's Tom doing?
Eddie.
Go.
They'll be fine. Just go. Come on.
Oh, they're one's let me out the door.
They'll let you out. In other words, Lenin reduced absolute materialism to epistemological realism, and having reduced absolute materialism to epistemological realism, claimed that Engels never had anything else in mind. For reasons to be considered later, Lenin asserted that the proposition, quote, materialism is the recognition of the external material world, quote, materialism is the recognition of the external world, that is, of the existence of things outside and independent of our mind, end quote, defines the basic position of every materialism. For the sake of brevity, this proposition will be referred to as epistemological materialism. Lenin repeatedly advanced epistemological materialism throughout his materialism and imperial criticism and claimed it to be equivalent to genetic materialism. Sorry, one second. Come on, man. Oh, never mind. I was gonna look something up, but guess I can't. One second. For the sake of brevity, this proposition will be referred to as epistemological materialism. Lenin repeatedly advanced this proposition that, quote, materialism is the recognition of the external world, that is, the existence of things outside and independent of our minds, end quote. Throughout his materialism and imperial criticism, and claimed it to be equivalent to genetic materialism. Epistemological materialism is not, however, Lenin's invention. Lenin pointed out that he found it in the Principles of Human Knowledge by Berkeley, who presented this ancient doctrine in the version refurbished by Locke. According to Berkeley, the, quote, materialist prejudice, end quote, consists in the belief that in the, quote, absolute existence of sensible objects in themselves or without the mind, end quote, or simply, quote, in the existence of external things, end quote. Berkeley. Footnote. That, quote, matter is the same as existing externally, end quote, was also affirmed by Hegel, who traced this definition back to Leibniz. See Science of Logic, Volume 1. To deny matter is not to deny the things we see and feel. End footnote. Denying matter is not to deny the things we see and feel. Quote, matters or, quote, material substance, end quote, are terms introduced by philosophers and used by philosophers. Philosophers imply a sort of independency or a subsistence distinct from being perceived by a mind, end quote. Footnote. See Principles of Human Knowledge, Section 24 and Section 54, 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous in the works of George Berkeley. End footnote. Is this definition of materialism which Lenin accepted as Lenin's own, not to refute it, as Berkeley did, but to establish it as the fundamental premise of all materialism? Quote, it is the sole categorical, this sole unconditional recognition of nature's existence outside the mind and perception of man that distinguishes dialectical materialism from relativist agnosticism and idealism. The sole, quote, property, end quote, of matter, with whose recognition philosophical materialism is bound up, is the property of being an objective reality, of existing outside our mind. The concept of matter, epistemologically implies nothing but objective reality, existing independently of the human mind and reflected by the human mind. End quote. Lenin. Lenin returned over and over again to the point that Lenin's principle of materialism exceeds the standpoint of phenomenalism as formulated by John Stuart Mill, that matter is the permanent possibility of sensation, or by Mach, for whom matter is more or less stable complexes of elements. In contradistinction to these thinkers, Lenin emphasized that materialism discerns and recognizes beyond the phenomena a reality which is independent of the cognizing subject and transcends what is directly given in experience, whereas phenomenalism insists that we have no empirical evidence for the existence of permanent things, and that the contrary opinion is nothing but, quote, a piece of gratuitous metaphysics, end quote. Lenin claimed knowledge of constant entities which are distinct from the series of their respective aspects. Footnote. See Bertrand Russell, Our Knowledge of the External World. End footnote. On the basis of the theory of knowledge accepted in materialism and imperial criticism, this doctrine of Lenin is indeed untenable and confronts Lenin with a difficulty closely resembling the predicament of Locke. On the one hand, Locke confessed that he could not explain what matter was, and on the other, Locke maintained that the existence of this, quote, something we know not what, end quote, had to be recognized as an inescapable necessity of thought. Footnote. See Locke, an essay concerning human understanding, Book 2, Chapter 23. End footnote. On the basis of his own premises, Lenin could not substantiate his assertion that matter was the objective reality directly given in experience. For if the object of perception is something of which we are exclusively aware as causing sensation in us, and this, according to Lenin, is the only thing of which we are aware, our knowledge of the objects is relative to us. Consequently, in the light of his own explanation, Lenin's position would not be distinguishable from phenomenalism. Only if the perceived object is something more than merely a cause of sensation, or if it displays certain absolute intrinsic properties which are primary in the sense that those properties do not in themselves depend on the interaction between the object and subject, including his measuring and other observation apparatus, and this Lenin seems firmly to have denied, we can affirm that our knowledge of the objects is not wholly relative to ourselves. There is not the slightest doubt that Lenin rejected phenomenalism. But what Lenin said about knowledge of external objects is exactly what a phenomenalist would maintain in justification of the phenomenalist point of view. Lenin seems to have run with the hare and hunted with the hounds, for Lenin endorsed some part of the phenomenalist argument and at the same time claimed to be in possession of knowledge concerning the existence of material substances, which the phenomenalist repudiates. Lenin did not succeed in refuting phenomenalism, but simply confronted phenomenalism with the blank statement that matter is the immediate and indisputably given reality. Footnote. It is sometimes said that Lenin managed to undermine phenomenalism seriously by Lenin's criticism that phenomenalism implied the denial of the well-attested fact that the world existed prior to the experience of life. See H.B. Acton, The Illusion of the Epoch. This argument is used by Lenin, but it was not his own. Lenin himself said that he found it in Feuerbach, Avenarius, J. Petzold, and R. Willy. Lenin was very careful not to commit himself to the view that the criticism in question applied to Mach's, quote, doctrine of elements, end quote, since, in fact, it does not. End footnote. Faced by the choice between the mutually exclusive claims of phenomenalism and realism, Lenin declared himself for realism, if for sociological rather than logical or epistemological reasons. Locke recognized the existence of matter, of which we know only, quote, that it is something, end quote, because without this, quote, support of qualities, end quote, there would be nothing in which qualities could inhere. Lenin supported Locke's belief for another reason, closely related to the philosophical developments of his own time. Lenin went beyond phenomenalism because Lenin understood phenomenalism, as represented by Mach or Avenarius, to imply that physical objects are constructions out of sense data, that physical objects are literally composed of, quote, sensations, and that physical objects are fictitious and only sense data real. There are some passages in Mach which could possibly be interpreted this way, although it is surely incorrect to present Mach's, quote, theory of elements, end quote, as an idealism of some sort. It is even conceivable that Lenin accused Mach of idealism to simplify the issue rather than to give an accurate account of Mach's views. Lenin's hostility to phenomenalism was directed against Mach's statement that the concept of matter is redundant, and that, quote, science suffers no loss when a, quote, matter, end quote, which is a rigid, sterile, constant, unknown something, is replaced by a constant law, end quote. Mach. Footnote. See Mach's analysis of sensations. The law, which was to replace the concept of matter, was the proposition that matter is a relatively constant combination of the elements dependent on one another according to laws. End footnote. Mach maintained that his, quote, doctrine of elements, end quote, provided a unified monistic frame of reference which enabled us to get rid of the confusion of the dualism of mind and body, and to establish a consistently empirical standpoint for natural science, one that we would not have to abandon when passing from physics to psychology or from psychology back to physics. Mach's basic aim was to make science, physics in particular, epistemologically independent of any metaphysical opinion, including materialism. See P.H.G. Frank, Modern Science and Its Philosophy. Lenin's anti-phenomenalist pronouncement reflected Lenin's belief that neither Mach's positivism nor Avenarius's empirical-criticism was a suitable theoretical basis for natural science, or above all for the performance by science of science's important social function. Mach's assertion that materialism was no longer a sound foundation of scientific knowledge was unjustifiable. Lenin rightly observed that scientists were, as a rule, inclined to adopt materialism. Mach himself complained that especially the physicists and chemists were alarmed by Mach's revision of the traditional concept of matter, although Mach failed to take due notice of the fact that the, quote, spontaneous, end quote, materialism of the men of science was a working hypothesis rather than a philosophical creed, which is what Lenin was interested in. His concern about the materialistic foundation of science was not, however, stirred by the scientist's inclination towards it. Lenin insisted that materialism alone was compatible with natural science because Lenin felt that the rejection of the traditional materialistic foundations of science was bound to open the door to arbitrary and wild conceptions about man and the universe, which in turn would obstruct and delay social progress toward socialism. But Lenin could not maintain his sociologically conditioned belief in the close connection between science and materialism unless belief in the existence of matter could be made secure from doubt. That matter is primarily given in experience expressed the proposition which seemed to satisfy his quest for certainty. Lenin sharply denied the charge that the materialist claim to an acquaintance with a reality independent of the cognizing subject necessarily accomplished as an illegitimate passage from the realm of experience to that beyond experience. It is not true, Lenin argued, that materialism is of necessity a transcendent view, because materialism recognizes an objective source of our sensations, one independent of man. Footnote. Lenin returned to this objection frequently, as if Lenin were aware of its strength and of the inadequacy of his own counter-arguments. Lenin seems to have believed that it was inconsistent, on the one hand, to assert that there are trees, stones, tables, or stars in the universe, and on the other to deny that there is such thing as matter. End footnote. There is no illegitimate passage from one fundamentally different realm to another, because there is no boundary between the appearance and the thing in itself, nor between the thing and the image of the thing. Rejecting the distinction between Ding an sich and its appearance, Lenin adopted the position that we can perceive things as things would be if they remained unknown, that is, as they are in themselves. Lenin wrote that, quote, for idealism there is no object without a subject, while for materialism the object exists independently of the subject and is reflected more or less adequately in the subject's mind. End quote. Footnote. Lenin asserted that to subscribe to this view is only to agree with Feuerbach, Marx, and Engels that nature exists prior to man. End footnote. The conviction that we can become more acquainted with entities as entities are in themselves provided, Lenin, with his second amplified definition of matter, which states that matter is not only objectively real but also knowable owing to matter's power of producing sensations. Quote, matter is a philosophical category designating the objective reality which is given to man by his sensations and which is copied, photographed, and reflected by our sensations while existing independently of them. What matter is that which, acting upon our sense organs, produces sensations. The concept of matter expresses nothing more than the objective reality which is given us in sensation. End quote. Lenin. Lenin's supplementary definition of matter reminds us of Holbach's definition. Quote, matter is that which acts upon our senses. Tauce qui agit sur nos sens et matière. I don't know. Let's see what that translates as. All what acts on our senses is natural. That's what that seems to mean. So, to repeat, Lenin's supplementary definition of matter reminds us of Holbach's definition. Matter is that which acts upon our senses. Matter thus produces perception and ideas and reveals, quote, some of matter's properties and qualities according to the way matter acts upon us, end quote. Lenin. Sorry. I gotta find the footnotes. I lost the footnotes. Hold on. Come on. Sorry, folks. Sorry. Footnote. Holbach, Système de la Nature, Tome 2. Sorry. Fuck, that wasn't actually the one that I was looking for. Principles of Human Knowledge, Section 56, the works of George Berkeley. Okay. Wait, no, that's... Fuck, I'm a mess. Forgive me. Alright. But Lenin's second supplementary definition of matter, which endows matter with the power of producing sensation, seems like Lenin's first definition to be borrowed from Berkeley rather than Holbach. Philosophers, wrote Berkeley, who believe that objects of perception have a substance distinct from being perceived, are inclined to think that our ideas must have causes extraneous to ourselves, and that our ideas, quote, are only images or resemblances imprinted by those objects on the mind, end quote. The theory which Berkeley criticized and rejected as certainly false is Locke's causal and representational theory of perception. Footnote: Locke, an essay concerning human understanding, Book 2, Chapter 1, and Book 4, Chapter 9. End footnote. Lenin replaced Locke's broad representationism by the copy theory of perception, but otherwise adopted Locke's epistemology unchanged. He maintained that objects existing independently of the mind are the cause of sensations, and on their part, sensations are the true copy or image of the objective reality. Since Berkeley and Lenin considered materialism to be the view that matter exists independently of being perceived or experienced, Berkeley and Lenin reduced materialism to epistemological realism. Lenin sometimes called the causal theory of knowledge, and in particular the copy theory of perception, quote, the materialist theory of knowledge, end quote, but more often referred to them simply as materialism, quote, if you admit physical objects that are independent of my sensations, and that cause sensation only by acting upon my retina, you are adopting the standpoint of materialism. It is the purest materialism to say that sensations are evoked in us by real objects. For the materialist, the, quote, factually given, end quote, is the outer world, the image of which is our sensations. End quote. Lenin. Lenin repeatedly argued that to accept the copy theory of perception is to subscribe to materialism, realism, and to adopt the standpoint of materialism, realism, is to endorse the copy theory of perception. Therefore, the two, copy theory of perception and materialism, should be recognized as inferentially equivalent theories. It is a general principle of all materialism that consciousness reflects being, and that sensations or ideas are copies, pictures, images, or reflections of things. On the other hand, if our sensations and ideas are only an image of the external world must exist independently of us, for, quote, the image inevitably and of necessity implies the objective reality of that which it, quote, images, end quote, end quote. Lenin. To say that epistemological materialism and the copy theory of perception are inferentially equivalent is an extremely strange assertion. If by epistemological materialism, epistemological realism is meant, it is hard to see any compelling ground why realism should logically imply either the theory of representative perception in general or the copy theory of perception in particular. There is even less reason for making such an assertion if epistemological materialism involves the denial of the belief that the world is composed of two kinds of stuff, matter and mind. For materialism is committed to the view that there are no mental images, as the theories of representative perception suppose, which mediate between the cognizing subject and the cognized object. Consequently, materialism seems to favor epistemological monism, viz. the assertion that there are no intermediaries in cognition, that whatever we know we apprehend directly, and that the content or data or perception consists of the same elements of which the external world is composed. Epistemological monism, and not epistemological dualism, seems to imply and to be implied by materialism. Lenin's dualist theory of knowledge is not only inconsistent with his metaphysical monism, but also favors the, quote, bifurcation of nature, end quote, which he refuted elsewhere no less energetically than did Whitehead. The important point to be noted in Lenin's definition of materialism is Lenin's epistemological concept of matter, to be sharply distinguished from Engels' metaphysical conception. Lenin did not ignore the fact that matter exists in time and space, and that it is ever-changing and in motion in conformity with the laws of nature. Occasionally he referred explicitly to these properties of matter. But Lenin did not make any use of these physical characteristics and defined matter in terms of the relation of sensation to sensation's physical cause, of the cognizing subject to the cognized object, of consciousness to the external world. Matter, Lenin argued, is known to us only as that which produces or is capable of producing certain impressions of our senses. All that we know about nature for certain is its power to produce these effects. Lenin's doctrine deserves the name of epistemological materialism because Lenin's doctrine makes materialism indistinguishable from epistemological realism, and its validity dependent upon the copy theory of perception. Without this theory, matter, which is the sole constitutive element of reality, would transcend every possible experience and would be inaccessible to knowledge. As Kant said, we should not understand what the inward nature of matter in this sense is if someone were in a position to tell us. Footnote: Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. But the copy theory of perception itself is not a tenable view. When more closely examined for relevance and consistency, the copy theory of perception fails to reach its own objective, to secure the knowledge of the objects of the external world, and turns out to be not only inaccurate but also highly vulnerable to destructive criticism. New section. Section 2. The reasons for the adoption of epistemological materialism. Epistemological materialism seems to offer certain immediate advantages. Epistemological materialism encouraged Lenin to consider all realists in the theory of knowledge as spontaneous adherents of materialism. Naive realism, Lenin wrote, whose main premise states that the external world exists independently of our minds, is the view of, quote, any healthy person who has not been an inmate of a lunatic asylum or a pupil of the idealist philosophers, end quote. Lenin. Materialism and imperial criticism. Lenin's paralogism is too apparent to deserve more than passing mention. Being a materialist entails being a realist, but one can be a realist, naive, or critical without supporting materialism. Sorry, I'm looking up paralogism. According to Merriam-Webster, a paralogism is a fallacious argument, or a piece of illogical or fallacious reasoning, especially one which appears superficially logical or which the reasoner believes to be logical. Back to the text. The identification of realism with materialism enabled Lenin to accuse Avenarius, Mach, and Pearson of idealism. Who's Pearson? I'm not really seeing anything easily accessible for Pearson. Since in Lenin's opinion the denial of the existence of matter entailed the denial of the existence of an objective reality, that is, of an external source of our sensations, the phenomenalists had openly or surreptitiously adopted the position of Berkeley. Although Avenarius, Mach, and Pearson only asserted that in the absence of mind there would be no experience, in the sense that nobody would experience anything, they were, according to Lenin, idealists just as much as Berkeley, who believed that in the absence of mind there would be nothing to be experienced. To recognize that knowledge of the external world is relative to the mind implied that the external world is entirely dependent upon the mind. On the other hand, since, quote, to be a materialist, end quote, meant simply, quote, to recognize the existence of an external world, end quote, materialists, contrary to the view of, quote, many idealists and all agnostics, end quote, were not metaphysicians. For to recognize the existence of an objective reality outside man, is not to transcend the bounds of experience, and to be a metaphysician means to transcend these bounds. Lenin did not, however, produce Lenin's new definition of materialism to exploit the shifting meaning and changing use of the term in spurious arguments designated to show that everybody in his right mind was a materialist. Lenin's conception of matter was forced upon Lenin by discoveries in physics and by Lenin's evaluation of these developments in physics. The advance of knowledge in physics made it clear that absolute materialism was no longer a tenable standpoint, and more generally that materialist philosophy ran a considerable risk in associating the concept of matter with any particular physical theory. Matter in contemporary physics could not be defined in terms of matter's ultimate particles, for the hope of discovering the irreducible particles had to be given up, nor could it be conceived as material substance. A contemporary physicist uses the term, quote, matter, but to refer to material objects of macroscopic theory and everyday life. However, there is no analog of matter as material substance in the theories of modern physics. Quote, the term, quote, matter, end quote, in the philosophical sense is not of direct scientific importance, and in purely scientific discussions could be dispensed with, end quote. C.B. Mast, Matter and Energy in Scientific Theory. Lenin's main line of argument in support of Lenin's epistemological concept of matter was as follows. A substance is supposed to be, quote, the support of accidents or qualities without the mind, end quote, that which has attributes and is indestructible and permanent. Footnote, The Principles of Human Knowledge, works of George Berkeley. End footnote. Lenin's main line of argument, while the analysis of matter into molecules and atoms, electrons and protons, systems of waves or systems of radiation, has established the case that matter is not a substance in the indicated sense, the dissolution of the substantiality of matter does not abolish materialism. Only metaphysical materialism determines matter in terms of an immutable substance or immutable element. For dialectical materialism, the quote essence or quote substance of a thing expresses only a given stage of knowledge about this thing. Therefore, the mutability of scientific knowledge about the structure of matter does not annihilate matter, nor does it refute the reality of the external world. If matter turns out to be something relative and transient rather than absolute and permanent, this provides only another corroboration of the truth of dialectical materialism, which rejects the immutability and recognizes only the external changeableness of all forms of moving matter. Matter can be defined neither as an immutable substance nor as a set of properties which can be attributed to every material body. For the properties which formerly seemed to be universal and absolute, such as impenetrability, permanence, hardness, inertia, mass, and so forth, are now revealed to be either relative or ascribable only to certain states of matter. It was the discovery that some states of matter do not possess the properties traditionally associated with it that prompted Bertrand Russell to say, quote, matter has become a mere ghost, end quote, or Henry Margenau to suggest, quote, Matter is no longer material, end quote. Footnote. Bertrand Russell, An Outline of Philosophy, and Henry Margenau, Open Vistas, end footnote. Wikipedia says Henry Margenau was a German-American physicist and philosopher of science. Back to the text. At the turn of this century, the electromagnetic theory of matter, and more recently, the revolutions in theoretical physics, the relativity and quantum theories, persuaded a considerable number of eminent scientists and philosophers that modern science invalidated the materialism based upon classical physics and supported an idealistic and spiritualistic conception of nature. Footnote. For a survey and logical analysis of these interpretations, see P.H.G. Frank, Modern Science and Its Philosophy. End footnote. Lenin criticized and fought against this philosophical trend with tenacity and much common sense. Lenin accepted the view that quote, solid matter fades away, end quote, and that the traditional conception of matter becomes untenable, because Lenin rejected the consequence allegedly deducible from these developments, namely, that matter itself turns out to be, quote, the creation of our mind, end quote, and that materialism can thus be dismissed as a self-contradictory doctrine. Lenin's attitude and judgment is methodologically sound. Every statement of physics is, in the final analysis, either a statement about an observation or a statement reducible to observational statements. Physics cannot therefore support the belief that, quote, mind is no longer an accidental intruder into the realm of matter, end quote, or that the universe looks, quote, more like a great thought than like a great machine, end quote. When J.H. Jeans made these pronouncements, he did not make use of the descriptive function of language. G.H. Jeans used language in an emotive way. The fuck is G.H. Jeans? Wikipedia says Sir James Hopwood Jeans, who lived from September 1877 to September 1946, was an English physicist, astronomer, and mathematician. Back to the text. When G.H. Jeans made these pronouncements, G.H. Jeans did not make use of the descriptive function of language. G.H. Jeans used language in an emotive way. G.H. Jeans did not impart cosmological knowledge. G.H. Jeans tried to convey his own cosmic mood. The, quote, revolution in natural science, end quote, only convinced Lenin that the metaphysical concept of matter had become highly vulnerable and had to be abandoned, to be replaced by Lenin's own epistemological conception, defense of the, quote, accepted beliefs of mankind, end quote, about the external world, that is, naive realism, and identification of these beliefs with materialism. In general, Lenin reasoned, the vulnerability of the metaphysical concept of matter resulted from the metaphysical concept of matter's close association with certain particular theories of matter. When they became obsolete, and this was bound to happen sooner or later, the definition of matter based on them became antiquated as well. On the other hand, the notion of matter conceived as a philosophical or epistemological category could even become outdated, and thus was clearly superior to the metaphysical conception. Whatever changes were introduced into the theory of matter, those changes could not affect philosophical materialism, that is, belief in the existence of the external world, which is studied by physics and natural science in general. If matter was a philosophical concept which designated objective reality, The concept of matter was immune to change, and materialism based upon such a concept was secure from destructive epistemological criticism. Section 3. The inadequacies of epistemological materialism. Unlike Plekhanov, Lenin made matter a purely epistemological concept, not because of Kant, but rather because of the development in physics. He tried to escape the difficulties arising from the, quote, disappearance of matter, end quote, and used against materialism by some of its opponents who were inclined to believe that the new discoveries of science favored idealism. Lenin felt that the offensive of idealism could not be stopped unless the concept of matter were redefined. This Lenin proceeded to do, although the gain thus obtained was rather illusory and the price Lenin had to pay for it was extremely high. When considered closely, Lenin's definition of matter effaces the difference between materialism on the one hand and objective idealism, immaterialism, or phenomenalism on the other. Lenin's definition, in which the sole, quote, property, end quote, of matter is, quote, the property of being an objective reality, of existing outside our mind, end quote, implies that for Lenin the predicates, quote, exist, and, quote, be real, end quote, had the same meaning, and that, quote, be material, and, quote, be real were coextensive. It should be observed that the proposition, quote, nothing exists but matter, end quote, equivalent to, quote, for all X exists if and only if X is matter, end quote, does not provide any criterion by which we can decide with respect to any particular value of X whether it does or does not exist, unless we know by other means that matter is and can distinguish a material object from a non-material object. The proposition, quote, nothing exists but matter, end quote, or, quote, matter is all that exists, end quote, has no distinctive meaning. First, if matter is all that exists, it would be self-contradictory to specify any characteristic which distinguishes matter from what is not matter, because what is not matter does not by definition exist. Second, the proposition, quote, nothing exists but matter, end quote, can be replaced by any other proposition of the same form and all-embracing significance, of which the proposition, quote, nothing exists but mind, end quote, may provide an instance. For in these all-inclusive contexts, both the concept of matter and that of mind signify the general idea of being, and consequently denote everything and connote nothing. To put it differently, statements of all-embracing significance are without significance. This was clearly seen by Berkeley, who used it as one of his main arguments against the idea of material substance. If, quote, material substance, end quote, has no other meaning than that of, quote, being in general, end quote, the term, quote, matter, end quote, is used in the same sense as other men use the term, quote, nothing, end quote. There is nothing distinctively materialist in Lenin's definition of matter. The best indication of this is the fact that Lenin's definition could be accepted by a Hegelian, a Platonist, or an epistemological realist, all of whom are hostile to materialism. For all of them would accept the proposition, quote, nothing exists but X, end quote, in which the values of X being coextensive and all-inclusive in their denotation would have no distinctive meaning, as well as the common sense view of reality for which, by definition, objects exist irrespective of whether or not those objects are perceived. Neither Plato nor Hegel would ever say that the common sense view of reality is false, though Plato and Hegel would insist that it is inadequate and should not be allowed to dominate philosophical thinking. It is the proper function of a philosophy to absorb the common sense point of view and to show that the common sense point of view's propositions, formulated in everyday discourse, cannot be sustained unless they are given quite different meaning from that which they purport to express. Lenin's definition of matter makes materialism indistinguishable from mentalism, idealism, or spiritualism. To say that Plato's ideas, Leibniz's monads, and Hegel's absolute spirit are not matter in Lenin's sense, and that to pretend ignorance of this fact is to simply prevaricate, provides no answer to this objection. It is true that we may have an idea about what Lenin believed to be material, but this would not enable us to decide in particular case what is and what is not matter. These two problems are quite different. The first requires an attentive reading of everything Lenin wrote. The second, a rule by means of which the question whether X is real, is true or false can be resolved. Although Lenin's definition of matter provides us with the directives concerning the use of the terms real and material, it gives no indication how to distinguish things which are real or material from those which are not. We cannot argue that in order to gain admission to the world of real or material objects, things must be able to exist without being perceived. For this criterion provides only the necessary but not the sufficient conditions for an object's being real or material. Lenin certainly would not regard a thing as a physical object unless that thing could exist unperceived, but it is impossible to say that nothing but physical objects satisfy this condition. That the ability to exist without being perceived is not a distinctive characteristic of material objects is clear from the fact that Plato would attribute it to ideas, Berkeley to minds, and Hegel to absolute spirit. Lenin frequently said that, sensation reveals objective truth to man, and implied that if an object is capable of being perceived, that object satisfies the criterion of being real and material. But contrary to what Lenin assumed, the fact that in specifiable circumstances an object seems to be perceived does not necessarily imply that this object is material or that it exists at all. In advancing this criterion, Lenin let himself be influenced by his phenomenalist opponent's belief that statements about physical objects are reducible to statements about sense data, or that the perception of an object is a sufficient condition for the existence of the object perceived. Since Lenin's definition of matter fails to indicate any distinctive characteristic of real or material objects, it also fails to say anything about the conditions under which, X is real, or, X is material, becomes a true or false statement. On the strength of what we know from Lenin's definition, we are not in a position to decide whether the statements, this table is real, or, centaurs are real, are true or false. The fact that from the truth or falsity of the proposition, centaurs are real, we can deduce the truth or the falsity of the proposition, centaurs are material, does not provide any help in this predicament. For, in the first place, we are unable to decide whether, centaurs are real, is a true or false proposition. Lenin's failure to specify the conditions which determine the truth value of the sentences obtained from the propositional form, X is real, or, X is material, is a serious defect of Lenin's theory. Lenin's supplementary definition of matter, matter is the objective reality given to us in sensation, clearly distinguishes a Hegelian or a Platonist from a materialist. But there is nothing in it that a Berkeleyan idealist or phenomenalist would not be willing to accept. Neither Berkeley nor Mach is committed to the view that there are no material or physical objects outside us, which are given to us in sensation, though both would account for this differently than would a materialist. For instance, they would say that the existence of a particular physical object is an empirical question which, as such, can never be conclusively verified. Neither Berkeley nor Mach would deny that the table on which I write and the lamp on the writing desk in front of me exist, and that they are given to me in sensation. This objection to Lenin's definitions was recognized as valid by some Marxist-Leninists in Poland, such as H. Eilstein. They also realized another shortcoming of Lenin's supplementary definition of matter. If we say that matter is the objective reality given to us in sensation, we do not wish to contend that only what is directly given in sensation is material. However, if, be material, is a predicate that may be used with reference to something that is not directly given in sensation, The epistemological view of materialism becomes indistinguishable from Thomist philosophy or any spiritualistic dualism. These and similar considerations lead to the conclusion that the independence of the philosophical concept of matter from the physicist concept of matter, as claimed and demanded by Lenin, cannot be maintained. An unambiguous answer to the question, quote, "What is the objectivity of the external world?" end quote, depends on the further question, quote, "What is matter?" end quote, in the physical sense of the term, quote, "matter," end quote. This implies, however, that Lenin's distinction between the philosophical and physical concept of matter must be abandoned, and matter defined as a meta-theoretical concept, which signifies the set of properties inherent in all physical objects. Section 4. The principle of partisanship and the dogma of the two main trends in philosophy. Despite all his protestations to the contrary, Lenin must have been aware of the fact that it is not enough to acknowledge belief in the existence of things outside our mind to endorse the viewpoint of materialism. For this reason, Lenin tried to establish a close logical link between epistemological materialism and genetic materialism, and for this reason, Lenin gave a new interpretation to Engels' genetic materialism. Although this new interpretation is Lenin's and not Engels', Lenin himself believed or tried to make others believe that his exposition faithfully reproduced Engels' views, even if expressed differently. It will be remembered that according to Engels, there are two conceptions of the relation of matter to mind. For the materialist, matter is primary and spirit secondary, and for the idealist, the reverse is the case. Plekhanov had gone a little beyond Engels' original formulation when Plekhanov conceded that, apart from materialist and idealist monism, a third standpoint is possible, that of dualism, which recognizes spirit and matter as separate and independent substances, matter and spirit as separate and independent substances, both involved as primary factors in the constitution of the universe. Lenin ignored Plekhanov's extension of Engels' pronouncement. Instead, Lenin transformed and sharpened the distinction of the two possible views on the relation of matter to spirit into the, quote, fundamental division of philosophical systems into idealism and materialism, end quote, or into the assumption of two radically different approaches to any problem of philosophy, from which ultimately the thesis of two and only two trends, camps, or alignments in philosophy was to emerge. If the differences of opinion concerning the problems of epistemology, methodology, and general philosophy are traced to their source, it turns out that all of the differences of opinion concerning the problems of epistemology, methodology, and general philosophy have a common origin in the struggle between materialism and idealism. Quote, behind the mass of new terminological devices, behind the litter of erudite scholasticism, we invariably discern two principal alignments, two fundamental trends in the solution of philosophical problems. Whether nature, matter, the physical, the external world be taken as primary and mind, spirit, sensation, experience as the widespread terminology of our time has it, the physical, etc., be regarded as secondary. That is the root question which in fact continues to divide the philosophers into two great camps. The source of thousands upon thousands of mistakes and of the confusion reigning in this sphere is the fact that beneath the envelope of terms, definitions, scholastic devices, and verbal artifices, these two fundamental trends are overlooked. End quote. Lenin. Materialism and empirical criticism. The division of all schools of thought and philosophy was not merely a classification intended to establish a kind of order in the great variety of contemporary philosophical trends, but reflected an essential and important trait of the social and historical situation. The antithesis of the two basic and radically different approaches to philosophy correspond to the division of modern society into two irreconcilably hostile classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, each with elements of its own culture and its own world outlook. Hence, it followed immediately that there was not and could not be a middle course between materialism and idealism, or between proletarian and bourgeois ideology. For a third ideology, it would have to be a non-class and non-partisan, and there could be no such ideology. In a society divided by class conflicts and antagonism, all doctrines of non-class politics were sheer nonsense. The antithesis of the two basic approaches also implied that the one could not be criticized without strengthening the other. The slightest deviation from materialism harmed materialism and benefited idealism. One did not need to undertake an examination of the innumerable hues of neo-Kantianism, agnosticism, or positivism in order to declare the entire tendency of these schools of thought a step backward. They doubted, restricted, or denied the knowability of the world. They made concessions to idealism and thus opened the door to fideism, the acceptance of the existence of God and an immortal soul. Quote, idealism in philosophy, end quote, was, according to Lenin, quote, a defense of a doctrine that places faith above science, or side by side with science, or in some way or another gives faith a place, end quote. Lenin. Consequently, in this respect, there was little difference between Mach and the theologians. That quote was from, or it appears to be from, the 25th anniversary of the death of Joseph Dietzgen. Having indicated that all differences of opinion in philosophy are connected with or determined by the adherence to either of the two possible philosophical parties, materialism and idealism, which result from the class division of society, Lenin proceeded to demonstrate that what Lenin was saying had already been established by Marx and Engels. Quote, all Marx's philosophical utterances, end quote, wrote Lenin, quoting only two of them, carefully selected for this purpose, quote, revolve within these fundamental opposites, bracket, that is idealism and materialism, end bracket, end quote. Marx excluded any intermediate position and, quote, moved forward along a sharply defined philosophical road, end quote. For this reason, Marx could not be taken piecemeal. Marx had, quote, either to be swallowed whole or completely rejected, end quote. Lenin, an estimate of Marx by international liberalism. The same was to be said of Engels, who constantly contrasted the materialist and idealist line, quote, in regard to all questions, end quote. The demand of a consistent adherence to materialism is the dominant core in all Engels' philosophical works. Quote, either materialism consistent to the end, or the falsehood and confusion of philosophical idealism, such as the formation of the question given in every paragraph of Anti-Düring, end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. According to Lenin, it was Marx and Engels who originated the idea of the two parties in philosophy and who are responsible for the view that adherence to materialism or idealism decided in advance the solution to practically all philosophical problems. It was they, too, who evinced the determination to keep materialism clear of any concession to idealism. Marx and Engels, Lenin wrote, were, quote, partisan in philosophy from start to finish, end quote. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Throughout Marx and Engels' entire careers, Marx and Engels persistently decried the failure to comprehend the importance and significance of the struggle between the two fundamental epistemological trends. Some thinkers, Lenin commented, boasted of their nonpartisanship. Others believed in their silly professorial devices and made, quote, the stupidest claim to have, quote, risen above, end quote, materialism and idealism, to have transcended this, quote, obsolete, end quote, antithesis, end quote. The fact remains, however, that philosophy was as partisan as political economy. Marx and Engels are the first to realize the impossibility of neutrality on the part of a philosopher, and Marx and Engels bequeathed to their successors the, quote, great and most precious tradition, end quote, of constant concern with the purity of materialism. Section 5. The revision of the laws of dialectics. Lenin revised not only Engels' conception of materialism, but also Engels' dialectical doctrine. It has been mentioned earlier that Plekhanov reduced the number of laws of dialectics from 3 to 2 by eliminating the law of the triad. Lenin accepted Plekhanov's reduction at the outset of his career. The development by triad, quote, has no connection whatever with scientific materialism, end quote. Quote, the dialectical method does not consist in triads at all, end quote. Quote, to prove anything by triads is absurd, end quote. And the term, quote, triad itself was a remnant of Hegelian vocabulary. In Anti-During, Engels argued that Marx did not try to demonstrate anything by means of the Hegelian triads, but he also defended the negation of the negation both as an extremely general law of nature and as a fruitful method of inquiry. Lenin rejected this argument completely. Lenin indicated that the main point in Engels' exposition of the place of the triad in Marx's thinking was to emphasize that, quote, the materialist must correctly and accurately depict the actual historical process, end quote. For the sole criterion of the validity of a theory was its conformity to reality. On the other hand, the, quote, insistence on dialectics, the selection of examples to demonstrate the correctness of the triad, is nothing but a relic of the Hegelianism out of which scientific materialism has grown, end quote. Lenin. Although later in Lenin's life the expression, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, cropped up occasionally under Lenin's pen, testifying to Hegel's increasing influence upon Lenin's mind, this does not necessarily indicate Lenin's rehabilitation of the triad. Lenin's mature views are recorded in the 2 fragments of philosophical notebooks entitled, quote, Elements of Dialectics, and, quote, On the Question of Dialectics, end quote. They are strongly infused with what Engels called abstracta und abstrusa Hegeli, and do not compare favorably with the observations on the dialectical method in What the, quote, Friends of the People, end quote, are, reference to which has just been made. In, quote, Elements of Dialectics, end quote, Lenin listed 16 subjects or points of view which would have to be considered in a comprehensive study of both subjective or immanent and objective or external dialectics. The list ends with the statement, quote, in brief, dialectics can be defined as the doctrine of the unity of opposites. The doctrine of the unity of opposites embodies the essence of dialectics, but the doctrine of the unity of opposites requires explanation and development, end quote. Lenin. Philosophical notebooks. While the list contains nothing striking or new, the conception of dialectics which emerges from the content and order of Lenin's observations reveals an important shift of emphasis and a further reduction in the number of dialectical laws. Like Plekhanov before him, Lenin attached most importance to the law of the unity of opposites, which in the fragment titled Elements of Dialectics is clearly treated as the fundamental law into which the others are subordinated or reduced. Quote, this aspect of dialectics, end quote, wrote Lenin elsewhere, quote, usually receives inadequate attention. The identity of opposites is taken as the sum total of examples and not as a law of cognition and as a law of the objective world, end quote. Lenin mentioned both Engels and Plekhanov as being responsible for the, quote, inadequate attention, end quote, given to the unity of opposites. On the other hand, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, to which Engels attached the greatest significance and which Plekhanov retained, together with the doctrine of leaps, as the second law of dialectics, is mentioned by Lenin in the fragment under discussion at the very end of his list. It is presented as a the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, to which Engels attached the greatest significance, and which Plekhanov retained, together with the doctrine of leaps, as the second law of dialectics, is mentioned by Lenin in the fragment under discussion at the very end of his list. It is presented as a particular case of the process of the transformation of everything into everything's opposite, this process being itself a dynamic aspect of the unity and struggle of opposites. The same applies to the negation of the negation, which also appears close to the end of Lenin's list and, as Plekhanov pointed out, is not an independent principle but follows from the unity of opposites. Consequently, the whole of the objective dialectics is in fact reduced to the unity of opposites. This point is actually made and explicitly stated by Lenin in the closing remark, quote, "Dialectics can be defined as the doctrine of the unity of opposites," end quote. Quoted above is the doctrine of contradiction in corporeal form that becomes the foundation of Lenin's dialectical materialism. Lenin uses the term, quote, use of the term, quote, dialectics, end quote, points in the same direction. Quote, "Dialectics in the proper sense," end quote, wrote Lenin, summing up in his own words the role of Hegel's immanent and external dialectics, quote, "is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects," end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. The thought that dialectics is the study of, quote, "objective contradictions," end quote, quote, "mutually exclusive," end quote, or, quote, "internally contradictory tendencies," end quote, of, quote, "the sum and unity of opposites," end quote, of the, quote, "unfolding of contradictory strivings," end quote, or of, quote, "the struggle of the opposites," end quote, is a common theme of philosophical notebooks. A, quote, "dialectical contradiction," end quote, Lenin emphasized elsewhere, quote, "has nothing to do with a verbal and invented contradiction," end quote. A, quote, "dialectical contradiction is not produced by the human mind but comes into being as, quote, the contradiction of life itself," end quote. Lenin, The Attitude of the Workers' Party Towards Religion. While emphasizing the importance of leaps in the process of natural development, Lenin pointed out that it is really the contradiction which generates the leap. Quote, "What distinguishes the dialectical transition from the undialectical transition?" End quote. Lenin asked. Quote, "The leap, the contradictions, the interruption of gradualness, the unity, parenthesis, identity, and parenthesis of being and non-being." End quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. Similarly, the nodal points signify a, quote, "unity of contradictions when being and non-being as vanishing moments, parenthesis, aspects, and parenthesis, coincide for a moment in the given moments, parenthesis, aspects, and parenthesis, of the movement," end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. The law of the unity or identity of opposites is the only dialectical law that is discussed in the fragment titled "On the Question of Dialectics." As formulated in the fragment "On the Question of Dialectics," the law of the unity or identity of opposites is both a, quote, "law of cognition," end quote, and a, quote, "law of the objective world," end quote. In the latter capacity, the law expresses, quote, "the recognition, parenthesis, discovery," end parenthesis, of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, parenthesis, including mind and society, end parenthesis, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. According to Lenin, its importance, the law of the unity or identity of opposites importance is based on the strange doctrine discovered by Marx and Engels as the core of the Hegelian philosophy, which recognizes in contradiction the ultimate source of change and motion. The unity of opposites objectively present in all things and phenomena of nature originates, quote, the self-movement of everything existing, end quote. Quote, self-movement, end quote, being defined as, quote, independent, spontaneous, internally necessary movement, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. The unity of opposites, quote, alone furnishes the key to the, quote, leaps, end quote, to the, quote, break in continuity, end quote, to the, quote, transformation into the opposite, end quote, to the destruction of the old and the emergence of the new, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. The unity of opposites is, therefore, the source of evolution and progress. Social development has a, quote, dialectical nature, end quote. Social development, quote, proceeds in contradictions and through contradictions, end quote. Lenin. It's from a piece titled Differences in the European Labor Movement. As long as things and phenomena are contradictory, we do not need any external impulse to produce change and motion. Owing to their internal polar structure, change and motion are generated by things themselves. Consequently, motion, change, and development are an essential property of matter. Immutability is not to be found anywhere in nature. The, quote, inner impulses for development, end quote, are, quote, imparted by the contradiction, the conflict of different forces and tendencies reacting on a given body, or inside a given phenomenon, or within a given society, end quote. Lenin. Things are living, mobile, becoming transformed into one another precisely because the unity of opposites, of contradictory strivings, or of mutually exclusive tendencies is objectively present in them and makes them living, mobile, and undergoing transformation. As a result of the transformation of moving matter from one state to another and of the dialectical transitions, there are no absolute boundaries in nature. The division into opposites is the main source of evolutionary advance, of the passage of matter from a lower to a higher state, and of the emergence of novel features and structures. Change, motion, and development always dominate over rest, changelessness, and permanence, since, quote, the unity of opposites is ... temporary, transitory, and relative, end quote. And, quote, the struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, end quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. For all these reasons, Lenin supported Plekhanov's view that the idea of evolution, quote, as formulated by Marx and Engels on the basis of Hegel's philosophy, is far more comprehensive and far richer in content than the current idea of evolution, end quote, which ignores leaps, catastrophes, and revolutions, and thus distorts the actual course of development in nature and society. Engels, Plekhanov, and Lenin combined efforts to produce a theory of evolution in which evolutionary cosmology, emergent evolution, and Hegel's panlogism merge into a single whole. It seems like, there's not really any great definitions, but it says that panlogism refers to the Hegelian doctrine that the universe is the act of realization of logos, and therefore logic and ontology are the same study. So like I was saying earlier, like it's Hegel's logic is an ontologic, right? Like logic and being are not distinct disciplines, right? Or metaphysics and logic are not distinct metaphysics. Are not distinct studies. I guess is what that means. That's my interpretation. Section 6, a comparison of Engels and Lenin's dialectical materialism. It is only to be expected, and in a certain sense inevitable, that the dialectical materialism of Engels and Lenin should differ. They formulated their respective doctrines in response to different needs. Besides, the intellectual climate had greatly changed in the period dividing ante-during and materialism and imperial criticism. What makes one wonder is not that there are differences, but the fact that these differences have been overlooked or ignored. Lenin retained the genetic materialism of Engels, but rejected Engels' absolute materialism. Lenin adopted this course to distinguish sharply between the philosophical concepts of matter, which Engels did not wish to separate. Engels believed that if the concept of matter were to have scientific significance, there must be some entity or entities in physical theory which would be the analog of matter in his sense of the word. Lenin no longer thought that this was either necessary or advisable. It was, quote, absolutely unpardonable, end quote, to define matter in terms of some characteristic inherent in all material objects, or to equate matter with some hypothetical entities which make up the universe of discourses of a physical theory. This would establish a close association between the concept of matter and such a theory and render the former dependent on the latter. At the time of radical advance in knowledge, such as the evolution in physics witnessed by Lenin at the beginning of this century, a close connection between the concept of matter and a particular physical theory armed the opponents of materialism with the argument that matter has vanished and that materialism has been refuted by science. Materialism, Lenin maintained, was not committed to any physical theory and did not recognize any property of matter except that of being an objective reality. Engels was unaware of the danger to materialism arising from the revival of Kantian critical philosophy, of which Engels had a poor opinion and considered objective idealism the main opponent of materialism. Unlike Engels, Lenin no longer needed to defend materialist philosophy against the defunct doctrine of objective materialism. But Lenin was vitally interested in protecting materialism from erosion by epistemological investigations, for Lenin could no longer ignore the threat of neo-Kantian and phenomenalist theories of epistemological and idealism and agnosticism as he described them, to metaphysics and Kant's meaning of the term, and therefore also to materialism. The abandonment of absolute materialism was a defensive move on Lenin's part, and the introduction of the philosophical concept of matter, divorced from any physical theory, was intended to make materialism immune from both the advancement of knowledge and the epistemological threat. While genetic materialism may have been the fundamental principle of materialism in a general philosophical sense, genetic materialism provided materialist philosophy with no protective shield against the destructive epistemological criticism. The reassertion of epistemological realism was an appropriate answer to the criticism of materialism from the phenomenalist viewpoint, but the defense of realism in the theory of knowledge could not uphold the claims of materialism. To fail to see this, as Lenin did, was to miss the point of the phenomenalist criticism. Lenin was entirely unaware of the fact that the truth of realism does not entail the truth of materialism. The two beliefs are not entirely independent of each other, but the belief in the truth of realism and materialism have to be defended on separate grounds. A statement of reasons for the acceptance of epistemological realism need not include the belief that the world is entirely material. On the other hand, a proof of the truth of materialism requires a quite different sort of evidence from that given in support of realism. The philosophical concept of matter, which has to buttress materialism by reducing its claim, has some serious disadvantages. If the term, quote, matter, end quote, is used to denote everything that exists objectively, independently of being perceived, the concept of matter loses its distinctiveness, for it signifies the idea of being in general. It no longer retains any connections whatsoever with the Aristotelian material substance, and becomes the inferred substratum of Locke, or substantia phenomenon of Kant, a, quote, mere something, end quote, whose, quote, inward nature, end quote, must remain unknown forever. Lenin's withdrawal from Engels' position may have made of materialism an impregnable fortress, but what this fortress defended was no longer clear. Here again, Lenin does not seem to have been aware of the consequences of his own amendment to Engels' doctrine. Having replaced absolute materialism by epistemological materialism, Lenin thought that he could still rely on the theoretical advantages which the former, absolute materialism, having replaced absolute materialism by epistemological materialism, Lenin thought that he could rely on the theoretical advantages of absolute materialism, but not epistemological materialism was able to provide. Consequently, Lenin made claims which his premises no longer logically sustained. On the other hand, however, the philosophical concept of matter forced Lenin to enlarge the range of problems with which materialism, as Lenin understood it, was concerned. Engels had no theory of knowledge, not even a rudimentary theory of knowledge, such as the copy theory of perception, though Lenin maintained that it was to be, quote, presented with absolute clarity, end quote, in Engels' introduction to the English edition of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Footnote. Recently, Lenin's claim has been questioned and rejected by some Marxist-Leninist scholars in Poland, such as Kautsky. End footnote. If the concept of matter is given a very broad meaning to designate everything that exists objectively or is real, and nothing is real unless it is independent of our mind, the question rises as to how we come to know what we claim to know, namely objective reality existing outside the human mind. Lenin's answer was a combination of the causal theory of knowledge and the copy theory of perception. I don't know, this AI overview says the causal theory of knowledge is a philosophical theory that states that a person can only know a proposition if there's a causal connection between the state of affairs that makes the proposition true and the person's belief in it. So anyway, back to the text. Lenin's answer was a combination of the causal theory of knowledge and the copy theory of perception. Lenin did not realize that the first, the causal theory of knowledge, is a scientific hypothesis, philosophically irrelevant, and that the second, copy theory of perception, is in principle unverifiable. It can never be shown to be, the copy theory of perception can never be shown to be either true or false. Lenin's epistemological materialism is hardly an improvement on Engels' absolute materialism. Its ontological implications have no cognitive significance. We can neither perceive nor say what matter in Lenin's sense is, and Lenin's epistemological materialism's epistemological assumptions fail to explain how we can claim the knowledge of objective reality, which Lenin did claim to have. Since Lenin denied that knowledge of objective reality was relative to the mind, Lenin put objective reality beyond the reach of the mind. Some of the differences in Engels and Lenin's conceptions of dialectics should be accounted for by the intellectually changed circumstances in which Engels and Lenin lived and worked. The emphasis given to Engels by Engels to the law of the transformation of quantity into quality was due to Engels' struggle against reductive materialism and the mechanistic conception of nature. Engels was anxious to establish the irreducibility of qualities to quantitative changes, the law-like connection between the qualitative and quantitative definiteness of phenomena, the emergence of novelty. Since Engels believed that the law in question secured the achievement of all these objectives, he placed it highest among the laws of dialectics. Lenin no longer needed to struggle against reductive materialism. The mechanistic conception of nature was being demolished by physicists and philosophers, and the doctrine of emergent evolution could do without the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. Lenin hardly ever mentioned Engels' favorite dialectical law, and, in fact, reduced it to the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. The same happened to the negation of the negation. Lenin retained the idea that the evolutionary advance preserves or reproduces the stage already passed in the ascent from lower to higher levels of development and incorporated into the law of the unity of opposites. But the negation of the negation itself is presented as a relic of the past, or at best as an implication of the principle concerning the contradictory nature of reality. Thus, Engels' three laws of dialectics were reduced by Lenin to one law, and the law of the unity and struggle of opposites assumed a role which it never had with Engels. It would be futile to try to explain this reduction and the importance attached by Lenin to the law of the unity and struggle of opposites by either logical or factual considerations. For none such could be found. Not much ingenuity would be required to carry out the reduction of the dialectical laws in an entirely different way. The reason for the changes accomplished by Lenin should be sought in their socio-cosmic significance. It can be said of Engels that Engels was genuinely interested in natural science and widely read in the scientific literature of Engels' time. Engels was, however, always ready to recognize that at best Engels could claim to be no more than a dilettante or semi-initiate in matters concerning astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, or geology. Engels qualified this statement by saying that despite his incompetence in matters of fact, Engels was just as entitled as a scientist to voice his own views concerning the general assumptions Engels qualified this statement by saying that despite his incompetence in matters of fact, Engels was just entitled as a scientist to voice his own views concerning the general assumptions of natural science, for even the professional natural scientist becomes a semi-initiate when he passes beyond his own specialty. One second, sorry. I have to find the footnotes to this thing. Sorry, I have to go find the footnotes in this piece. 1 second. Come on, man. What's going on here? One second. Alright, I think we're getting there, kids. I think I almost found it. '87. Okay. Sorry, there's just footnotes saying that idea comes from Anti-Durham. Engels himself disclosed, however, that the general assumptions of natural science in which Engels was interested were known to Engels before he started his inquiry. Engels confessed that he undertook his studies in mathematics and natural science to convince himself in detail of what he was certain in general, that the same dialectical laws of motion to which history and the development of human thought conform govern the world of nature also. The dialectical laws of motion, first discovered by Hegel, were to be stripped of their Hegelian mystic form and formulated in their, quote, complete simplicity and universality, end quote. Engels, Anti-Durham. As a result of his plan, Engels was engaged for many years in translating contemporary science into the language of Hegelian philosophy, only to confess in the end that this task exceeded the strength of one man. Footnote. When Engels spoke of Dühring's, quote, lame attempt to make the Hegelian categories usable in the philosophy of history, end quote, Anti-Dühring, Engels did not object to the attempt itself, but to the attempt's inadequacy. End footnote. When Engels undertook his assignment, he was aware of the advantages which Hegel's dialectics could offer to a revolutionary movement. Engels emphasized on several occasions that dialectical philosophy, as he understood it, dealt a death blow to the permanency of all products of human thought and action. For dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute, and sacred. Quote, dialectical philosophy reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything. Nothing can endure before it accepts the uninterrupted process of becoming and of passing away, of endless ascendancy from the lower to the higher, end quote. Engels. Ludwig Feuerbach. Footnote. A similar statement by Marx formulated in even stronger terms is to be found in Capital Volume 1, page 20. There is also a conservative side to dialectical philosophy. End footnote. There is also a conservative side to dialectical philosophy. Dialectical philosophy recognizes that every definite stage of social development is justified for its time and circumstances. The conservatism of dialectical philosophy is, however, relative, its revolutionary character absolute. To formulate the laws of dialectics in their, quote, complete simplicity and universality, end quote, was therefore to establish the revolution, as it were, at the very start of the cosmos. While the socio-cosmic character of Engels' generalizations of dialectics cannot be questioned, Engels' interest in natural science exercised a certain moderating influence upon it. This cannot be said of either Plekhanov or Lenin. Plekhanov and Lenin were not interested in natural science and natural science's general theoretical assumptions for their own sake, but mainly, if not exclusively, for the sake of their alleged implications with respect to the political problems which Plekhanov and Lenin were faced. If Plekhanov emphatically affirmed the principle of leap-like qualitative changes in nature, Plekhanov did so to deduce from it the principle of leap-like qualitative changes in nature, the qualitative changes in social life, and, as it were, to reveal the cosmic necessity of social and political revolutions. If Lenin placed the law of the unity and struggle of opposites first, and subordinated or reduced the two remaining dialectical laws to it, Lenin did this in order to emphasize the cosmic significance of strife. If, quote, everything happens through struggle, end quote, and progress is accomplished by the division into opposites, which then attain a higher unity by the destruction of the old and the emergence of new forms of existence, then social life is necessarily full of contradictions, and the conflict of antagonistic classes is what determines social advance. Therefore, social progress is cosmically preordained and culminates in the inevitable victory of the revolutionary class over its conservative adversary. It has been mentioned earlier that Engels showed a certain moderation in Engels' generalization of the laws of dialectics into socio-cosmic laws. Engels never made any unconditional claim to truth for Engels' doctrine and clearly rejected the view that any single individual could attain knowledge that is certain and final. Engels' genuinely evolutionary conception of nature, Engels preferred to refer to it as his evolutionary concept of nature as dialectical, and Engels' theory of the relativity of knowledge are interrelated. If everything is subject to constant change and development, human knowledge must remain limited and provisional at any stage of its realization. Only an endless succession of generations can draw closer and closer to the unconditional and absolute truth. Lenin never managed to distinguish clearly between Engels' theory of the relativity of knowledge, the thesis of phenomenalism, and the doctrine of the relativity of truth. According to Lenin, knowledge grows and expands without limit, and as there is no final truth. This does not imply that there is an, quote, impassable boundary between relative and absolute truth, end quote. Dialectical materialism affirms that no such boundary exists. Engels, Lenin argued, was a dialectician, and for Engels, quote, absolute truth is compounded from relative truths, end quote. Revising Engels' view on the relativity of knowledge, Lenin claimed that human thought is capable of discovering absolute truth, compounded of relative truths, and that, quote, each step in the development of science adds new gains to the sum of absolute truth, end quote. The dialectics of Marx and Engels recognize the relativity of all our knowledge, but only in the sense that the limits and approximation to truth at any given time are historically conditioned. Lenin, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. Lenin's socio-cosmic interpretation of the laws of dialectics is reinforced not only by Lenin's repudiation of the theory of the relativity of knowledge, but also by his instrumentalist conception of philosophy and science. There is a difference between asserting P, because P is a means towards achievement of a certain cherished or valued aim, such as the invention of technical facilities, simplification of calculations, provision of predictions, or assistance in persuading people about the advisability of believing in P, and asserting P because P is believed to be true. For to be interested in the truth and falsehood of our theories is to consider that the main purpose of science is to discover what actually exists in nature, and to what laws nature is subject. Karl Popper called the first of these conceptions the, quote, instrumentalist, end quote, and the second the, quote, Galilean view of knowledge, end quote. Quote, the instrumentalist view asserts that theories are nothing but instruments, while the Galilean view is that they are not only instruments, but also, and mainly, descriptions of the world, or of certain aspects of the world, end quote. Karl Popper, Conjectures and Refutations. The latter conception of science is inspired by the wish to understand the world and by the belief that efforts to this effect are not in vain. Although we discard our theories and replace our theories by others, this unceasing process of exceeding our intellectual ancestors is impressive evidence to the success of our attempts to gain an understanding of the physical world. On the other hand, the instrumentalist view of knowledge renounces the hope of ever understanding anything, and sees in science nothing but an instrument devoid of theoretical or cognitive significance, and true only in the sense of being operationally and technologically useful. Lenin's conception of philosophy and science is an instance of the instrumentalist view in Popper's sense. In Lenin's case, the instrumentality of science does not lie in science's pragmatic significance or in the technological power which science provides, but in science's usefulness in guiding and influence human attitudes and conduct. The procedure which Lenin applied in Lenin's redefinition of matter and materialism provides an instance and point. In Lenin's endeavor to answer the question, quote, "What is materialism?" end quote, or, quote, "What is matter?" end quote, Lenin was not guided by the philosopher's or scientist's interest in truth. Lenin's tactics, which Lenin himself stated explicitly, were intended to produce a definition of matter and materialism that would be secure from change and never become dated. Lenin regarded this security as desirable and necessary, if any political and social objectives were to be achieved. Lenin believed that people would not fight effectively for socialism and communism unless they were materialists. People could not become materialists, however, unless adherence to materialism carried a simple, clear, and invariant meaning. Philosophy had only an instrumental value. Philosophy was a means for the attainment of some superior aims. Lenin was a, quote, "practical thinker to the depth of his mind," end quote, one who made use of Marxian mechanics of history to become the maker and not merely a, quote, "midwife of revolution," end quote. Trotsky called Lenin, quote, "the great engineer of history," end quote, whose whole life, quote, not only in politics but also in his theoretical works, in his philosophical speculations, was continually possessed by one and the same idea, the goal, end quote. The goal was the seizure of power and the revolutionary conquest of the surface of the earth. Footnote: Leon Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution, Volume 3, and Max Eastman, Marx and Lenin. Lenin's whole outlook on the world and life was adapted to the requirements of revolution. Lenin acquired knowledge, whether in agricultural economics or philosophy, for conflict and action, and he had no patience with contemplation and no use for knowledge's own sake. In this respect, the contrast between Marx and Lenin is deep and striking. The entire Marx, wrote Trotsky, is contained in the Communist Manifesto, in the preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and in Capital. Quote, Lenin, on the other hand, expands at once into revolutionary action. Lenin's works as a scholar mean only a preparation for action. If Lenin had never published a single book, Lenin would still appear in history what he now is, the leader of the proletarian revolution. End quote, Trotsky. That's from Leon Trotsky's Lenin. Footnote: a striking and very similar portrait of Lenin is found in N. Berdiaev, The Origin of Russian Communism. That writer is as different as Trotsky, and Berdiaev would see Lenin in very much the same way as a persuasive evidence of the accuracy of their portraits from memory. End footnote. Lenin's instrumentalist view of philosophy finds perhaps the clearest expression in his assertion concerning philosophy's partisan character. Lenin boldly announced that there was no politically neutral philosophy and that non-partisanship in philosophy was impossible. In his view, this was no new development, for, quote, recent philosophy is as partisan as was philosophy 2,000 years ago, end quote. Lenin. Materialism and imperial criticism. To expect that in a society based on class divisions and domination, philosophy may be impartial was, as Lenin put it, silly and naive. Footnote: Lenin, the three sources and three components of Marxism. Quote, in a society torn by class antagonism, there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology, end quote. Lenin, what is to be done? No thinker could escape the, quote, struggle of parties in philosophy, end quote. A struggle which ultimately and ideologically reflects the conflicts of the class-divided society. There was a close connection between the interest and relative position of a social class in society, on the one hand, and the philosophical trends which it favored on the other. A philosopher could not and should not be free from partisanship, for the philosopher's very neutrality would provide help and support to one of the other alignment of the class forces. In social conditions which were characterized by class antagonism, objectivism was bound to run the risk of becoming an apology for these conditions. In such circumstances, neutrality could not but be hypocritical or mendacious. Lenin did not attempt to conceal the fact that his dialectical materialism was conceived as a weapon in the class struggle and an instrument for the achievement of victory in it. As he himself confessed, quote, "Materialism includes partisanship, so to speak, and enjoins the direct and open adoption of the standpoint of a definite social group in any assessment of events," end quote. Lenin, The Economic Content of Neurotism. For Lenin, knowledge was valueless if knowledge did not assist the oppressed class in the oppressed class's revolutionary action. The highest merit of the Marxian doctrine was that it bound the theory and practice of this struggle for emancipation into one inseparable whole from which the revolutionaries could draw their convictions and which provided them with the rules for action. Footnote. See Lenin, Our Program, and preface to the Russian translation of Karl Marx's letters to Dr. Kugelmann. End footnote. Next section. Section 7. Lenin's political atheism. Lenin's philosophical instrumentalism helps us to understand why Lenin attached such tremendous importance to the law of the unity and struggle of opposites. The law consists of 3 parts. The law states the contradictory nature of all reality. It conceives of all development as a movement from a unity of contradictory characteristics through the division into contradictories or contraries, revealing themselves as conflict and struggle of mutually exclusive tendencies, or as the transition of a thing into a thing's opposite, to another unity of contradictory characteristics on a new and higher level, and finally indicates the nature of the internal motive force of the development of matter. Development, Lenin asserted, is, quote, a unity of opposites, the division of a unity into mutually exclusive opposites and their reciprocal relations, end quote. Lenin, The Philosophical Notebooks. All 3 statements included in the law of unity and struggle of opposites are socio-cosmic generalizations, but it is the last one that deserves some additional comment because of its instrumental significance. According to Engels, the mechanistic conception of nature posed a false dilemma. Either we are able to provide an explanation of the origin of motion and of the diversity of its forms by natural causes, or we have to recognize that the universe has a creator. This dilemma can arise only if motion is reduced to change of place, brought about by mechanical force. For should this be the case, then we are unable to dispense with an impulse from outside, that is, with God, unless we can explain how matter passed from an original state of equilibrium into a subsequent state of motion. Engels himself believed that all difficulties disappear if we accept the proposition, quote, motion is the mode of existence of matter, end quote. If matter without motion is just as inconceivable as motion without matter, motion is as uncreatable and indestructible as matter itself. As has been explained earlier, this argument is not flawless. While in classical physics, motion entails the existence of matter, a motionless state of matter is not irreconcilable. Moreover, in the proposition, quote, motion is the mode of existence of matter, end quote, the term, quote, motion, end quote, refers to all kinds of change. They say that motion is the mode of existence of matter, is therefore to ascribe to matter the power of creation and thus account for the diversity of its forms, as well as for the emergence of novelty. This is the principle of emergent evolution. The assertion that matter is capable of creating novelty and of producing higher and higher forms of organization has been part and parcel of dialectical materialism ever since it was first formulated by Engels. But to combine materialism with the doctrine of emergence is one thing. To say that matter is creative of novelty because a motionless state of matter is inconceivable is something quite different. While combining materialism and the doctrine of emergence is a bold metaphysical assumption arising from the belief in cosmic purpose, the belief that matter is creative of novelty because a motionless state of matter is inconceivable is an invalid argument based on an equivocation and a false assumption. For Engels, the question concerning the existence of God was subordinated to the problem of the relation of spirit to nature or of mind to matter. The God of whom Engels spoke was the demiurge of Plato, the clockmaker of Fontenelle, or the engineer of Newton. If materialism succeeded in showing that the world was in no need of a ruler and creator, a cosmic atheism would thus be established. Engels spoke of the God of the philosophers, defined in terms of a set of cosmological propositions, and not the God of whom we learn from the Old and New Testament, the subject of all existence in vital relationship with his creation and the object of worship, love, fear, and prayer. Engels would not attach much importance to the views and sentiments of such thinkers as Etienne Gilson, who said, quote, "The fact that there is no demiurge does not prove that there is no God," end quote. And demiurge, I think, just means like original initiator. The originator. The dictionary demiurge says a being responsible for the creation of the universe. In Platonic philosophy, it's the maker or creator of the world. In Gnosticism and other theological systems, a heavenly being, subordinate to the supreme being that is considered to be the controller of the material world and antagonistic to all that is purely spiritual. And Etienne Gilson, or I must have looked up before, because it's something I did, was a French philosopher and historian of philosophy. A scholar of medieval philosophy, Etienne Gilson originally specialized in the thought of Descartes. Etienne Gilson also philosophized in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, although Etienne Gilson did not consider himself a neo-Thomist philosopher. In 1946, Etienne Gilson attained the distinction of being elected a, quote, immortal, end quote, parenthesis, member, end parenthesis, of the Académie Française. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. In 2009, the International Etienne Gilson Society was created, quote, to promote the thought of Etienne Gilson and classical philosophy in the academy and culture, end quote. It publishes a journal, Studia Gilsoniana. And the Wikipedia for demiurge says, in the Platonic, Neo-Pythagorean, Middle Platonic, and Neoplatonic schools of philosophy, the demiurge, sometimes spelled as, doesn't matter, is an artisan-like figure responsible for fashioning and maintaining the physical universe. The Gnostics adopted the term demiurge. Although a fashioner, the demiurge is not necessarily the same as the creator figure in the monotheistic sense, because the demiurge itself and the material from which the demiurge fashions the universe are both considered consequences of something else. Depending on the system, they may be considered either uncreated and eternal, or the product of some other entity. The word demiurge is an English word derived from demiurgus, a Latinized form of the Greek demiurgos. It was originally a common noun meaning, quote, craftsman or, quote, artisan, but gradually came to mean, quote, producer and eventually, quote, creator. The philosophical usage of the proper noun derived from Plato's Timaeus, written circa 360 BC, where the demiurge is presented as the creator of the universe. The demiurge is also described as a creator in the Platonic, circa 310 to 390 BC, and Middle Platonic, circa 90 BC to 300 AD, philosophical traditions. In the various branches of the Neoplatonic school, 3rd century onwards, the demiurge is the fashioner of the real, perceptible world after the model of the ideas, but in most Neoplatonic systems is still not itself, quote, the one, end quote. In the arch-dualist ideology of the various Gnostic systems, the material universe is evil, while the non-material world is good. According to some strains of Gnosticism, the demiurge is malevolent, as it is linked to the material world. In other words, including the teaching of Valentinus, the demiurge is simply ignorant or misguided. So, back to the text. Engels would not attach much importance to the views and sentiments of such thinkers as Etienne Gilson, who said, quote, the fact that there is no demiurge does not prove that there is no God, end quote. Etienne Gilson, God and Philosophy. Engels endorsed Feuerbach's theory of religion, which contended that religion is the projection of man's hopes and fears. The belief in God is the result of man's misery, weakness, dependence, and servitude to the elemental powers of nature and to the blind forces of society. A man who did not live in fear and oppression would have no need for God. Quote, all religion is nothing but the fantastic reflection in men's minds of those external forces which control their daily life, a reflection in which the terrestrial forces assume the form of supernatural forces. End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Footnote. See Ludwig Feuerbach and Dialectics of Nature, where the same problem is discussed on a broader social and historical basis. End footnote. Man was not created in the image of God, but man created God in his own image by ascribing to God the highest attributes of the human species. He thus inverted the true relation between man and God and transferred the attainment of the highest human potentialities from this to another world. If man divests himself of his supreme attributes and identifies God with his essence, religion impoverishes him and strips him of his strength. He must feel empty and insignificant in comparison with the God whom he created and upon whom he bestowed everything. To put it in Feuerbach's own words, quote, to enrich God, man must become poor. That God may be all, man must be nothing, end quote. Ludwig Feuerbach, The Essence of Christianity. The experience of something transcending the self and all the objects of experience can be explained without resorting to the hypothesis that there is actually a transcending object which is the cause of that experience. For Lenin, unlike Engels, the question, quote, was the world created by God or does the world exist from eternity, end quote, assumed a greater significance in a sharper form than the question as to whether nature precedes spirit or spirit nature. As Lenin saw it, the answer to the first question determined the answer to the second and not the other way around. This may have been due to Lenin's dominating concern with practical, social, and political problems and to his inclination to see the universe in sociomorphic terms. When the universe is viewed from the standpoint of society, the value of a metaphysical or theological proposition for human life and conduct becomes the decisive reason for its acceptance or rejection. For Lenin, a metaphysical or theological proposition was important and significant if that metaphysical or theological proposition made the desired social and political change possible. Lenin recognized that dialectical materialism fully accepts, quote, the historical traditions of 18th century materialism in France and of Feuerbach, in Germany, a materialism which is absolutely atheistic and positively hostile to all religion, end quote. Lenin. That's from a piece titled The Attitude of the Workers' Party Towards Religion. By having made this statement, Lenin concentrated practically all his efforts on the thesis, prominent in Marx rather than in Engels, that in modern societies the basis of religion is primarily social. Quote, the deepest root of religion today is the socially downtrodden conditions of the working masses and their apparently complete helplessness in face of the blind forces of capitalism, end quote. Referring to Feuerbach's philosophy of religion, Lenin wrote that, quote, the yoke of religion is merely a product and reflection of the economic yoke within society, end quote. Lenin, Socialism and Religion. Lenin clearly agreed with Feuerbach that God comes from, quote, the feeling of a want, what man is in need of, that is God, end quote. Ludwig Feuerbach, The Essence of Christianity. Religion was the ideology of helplessness and resignation which encouraged men to accept their fate. As Marx put it, religion is an expression of misery in actual life, quote, the sign of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of a heartless world, and the soul of the soulless conditions, end quote. Marx. Contrary to what is often said, Marx did not find in religion as such the fons et origo malorum. Rather, he regarded religion as an expression and effect of deep-lying social evils and set out to destroy not so much religion as religion's source and cause. Sorry, I'm looking up what that last bit means. Source and the origin of evils. So, contrary to what is often said, Marx did not find in religion as such the fons et origo malorum, or the source and the origin of evils. Rather, Marx regarded religion as an expression and effect of deep-lying social evils and set out to destroy not so much religion as religion's source and cause. Footnote, it is true that Marx accused Christianity of defending the oppression of the proletariat. See, for example, Der Kommunismus des Rheinischen Beobachters in particular. But such polemical sorties do not represent the main line of Marxist thinking about religion. Lenin agreed not only with Marx's diagnosis, but also with his remedy, deduced from Feuerbach's theory of religion. Feuerbach asserted that man created God, and the act of imagining that God had created man paves the way for man's emancipation from the spiritual burden of his own creation, because it discloses the fact that man's image of the highest being is man himself. This theoretical insight gives rise to the categorical imperative to overthrow the social conditions in which man is not the highest being, but a humbled, oppressed, and despised creature. The belief in God is incompatible with political and social action which aims at the betterment of human life on earth. Lenin's atheism is social or political atheism rather than cosmological, derived from theoretical considerations. Lenin inherited the belief that as long as social and economic oppression is not done away with, religion dominates the minds of men and constitutes, in the hands of the exploiters, the first and foremost moral means of keeping the masses in subjection. Religion distorts the view of the social conditions of existence, for religion makes people oblivious or tolerant of social misery and injustice and persuades people to regard this evil as unavoidable, a dispensation of providence whose wisdom should not be questioned, nor its ways be mended. The, quote, witchery of religion, end quote, of which Marx spoke, refers to these implications of the religious view of life and of the preoccupation with the supernatural order. In Lenin's mind, religion was closely associated with societies founded on individual property and the exploitation of wage labor. It is economic slavery that is the true source of religion. Therefore, in order to fight effectively the roots of modern religion, one has to fight the rule of capital. Quote, impotence of the exploited classes in their struggle against the exploiters just as inevitably gives rise to the belief in a better life after death as impotence of the savage in his battle with nature gives rise to the belief in gods, end quote. Lenin, Socialism and Religion. But those burdened by want, those who work for the profit of others, do not find in religion a genuine spiritual succor or consolation. Lenin rejected the view that religion could ever contribute in any way to the well-being of men. The idea of God did not arouse social sentiments. It lulled and blunted social sentiments, substituting a concern for the dead for an interest in the living and making people indifferent to the fate of their fellow men. Quote, the idea of God has never, quote, linked the individual with society, end quote. The idea of God always tied the oppressed classes hand and foot with faith in the divinity of the oppressors, end quote. Lenin. Letter to Maxim Gorky, written November 1913. In a society so organized that a small minority enjoys wealth and power while the masses suffer privation, it is natural for the exploiters to sympathize with a religion that teaches the people to bear hell on earth for the sake of everlasting salvation in alleged celestial paradise. Religions and churches and all religious organizations are only instruments of the bourgeoisie that serve to defend exploitation and to befuddle the working class, end quote. Lenin, Political Agitation and the Class Point of View. Footnote. Lenin, Political Agitation and the Class Point of View, Socialism and Religion, the Attitude of the Workers' Party towards Religion, the influence of Marx's atheism upon Lenin fell on fertile ground. In the Russian Revolution, Nicholas Berdiaev pointed out that atheism in Russia was, as a rule, social motives at its source and arose from the conflict between Christian beliefs and social injustice rather than from the conflict between religious faith and scientific knowledge. End footnote. Lenin endorsed the view of Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, that if it is natural for the capitalist to believe in a providence because it raises the capitalist to the position of wealth and opulent indolence, it is equally natural for the proletarian to consider himself as his own providence. The modern industrial class-conscious worker, wrote Lenin, leaves heaven to the priests and bourgeois bigots and generally casts aside all religious prejudices. Quote, the proletariat of today takes the side of socialism, which enlists science in the battle against the fog of religion and frees the workers from their belief in life after death by welding them together to fight in the present for a better life on earth. End quote. Lenin, Socialism and Religion. Thus, it is clear that according to Lenin, one cannot truly believe in communism if one believes in the existence of God, and one cannot fight for socialism on earth if one obeys the divine laws. The two beliefs are mutually exclusive. Each of them lays a total, all-embracing claim upon man. To hold one necessitates the repudiation of the other. Therefore, every attempt to justify the idea of God, quote, even the most refined and well-intentioned, end quote, is, according to Lenin, quote, a justification of reaction, end quote. And every concession to idealism, which is a disguised form of fideism or fideism, and opens the door to the belief in God, is an unpardonable philosophical sin. For Lenin, the conclusive demonstration that God did not exist took on a significance which it had never had either for Marx or for Engels.
Section 8. The dialectical justification of cosmological atheism. But how can the superfluity of God be conclusively demonstrated? Since the external forces dominating men's minds and lives, which are reflected in religious beliefs, may be either the forces of nature or social forces, the critique of religion can take two main forms, be either a cosmological or a political and social atheism. The two forms of atheism need not be closely associated with each other, and this was the case with Marx and Engels. Whereas Marx's atheism was social and political rather than cosmological, Engels' atheism was cosmological rather than social and political. While the advance of natural science abolishes the cosmic basis of the belief in God, it does not do away with the social basis. Marx, Engels, and Lenin were in full agreement that mere knowledge of the social sources of religion was not enough to abolish religion. The belief in God cannot be destroyed by the provisions of the Constitution, the suppressive measures of the state, by decrees and prohibitions. It must die a natural death. God will die in the minds of men when they are released from the bondage of economic conditions which they themselves have created. When people are no longer dominated by the means of production and the corresponding social relations as by an alien force, the conditions favorable to an inverted reflection of this force in religious belief will vanish too, for then there will no longer be anything left to reflect and invert. One second. Gotta get to the notes. Let's see how long this takes. Alright, I actually got pretty close in a reasonable time. Okay, what's it? The footnote is 120. Okay. Footnote, see Engels' Anti-During, pages 430-67, and Lenin's The Attitude of the Workers' Party Towards Religion. Okay. End footnote. Consistent materialism and the critique of the cosmological sources of the idea of God provide, therefore, the main instruments for arousing people from their religious torpor. But it was inadvisable to accept without any change Engels' proof of the redundancy of God. Engels derived cosmological atheism from a theory of the universe, and such a theory can establish only contingent truths. It is also exposed to the danger of being refuted or becoming obsolete. Lenin was fully aware of this peril, and in order to avoid precisely this kind of risk, he replaced absolute materialism by epistemological materialism. Engels' procedure had to be improved upon and simplified. It is not the uncreatability and indestructibility of matter, but the uncreatability and indestructibility of motion that prompts people to accept the existence of God. It was Aristotle who accomplished the conjunction of the idea of God with the notion of the prime mover and the supreme cause of the world. If whatever is in motion must be put in motion by something else, quote, omne quod movetur ab alio movetur, unquote, as the schoolmen rendered the peripatetic premise in Latin, end parenthesis. And this causal regress cannot go on in infinitum, because there would be no prime mover and consequently nothing would be moved. It is necessary to arrive at a prime, unmoved mover, which Aristotle understood to be God. 1 second. Oh, man. Fall's coming, dude. Fall is not good for free associations allergies. Alright. Where am I? Okay, I wanted to look some things up. First, gotta look up this Latin. All that is moved by another is what omne quod movetur ab alio movetur means. And what the hell does peripatetic mean?
Peripatetic.
Peripatetic means traveling from place to place, in particular working or based in various places for relatively short periods. Or it can mean Aristotelian. The noun can mean a person who travels from place to place, and it could also mean an Aristotelian philosopher. Wikipedia says the peripatetic school was a philosophical school founded in 335 by Aristotle in the Lyceum in ancient Athens. It was an informal institution whose members conducted philosophical and scientific inquiries. After the middle of the 3rd century, the school fell into decline, and it was not until the Roman Empire that there was a revival. Alright, so back to the text. If whatever is in motion must be put in motion by something else, quote, omne quod movetur ab alio movetur, end quote, as the schoolmen rendered the peripatetic premise in Latin, end parenthesis. And this causal regress cannot go on in infinitum, because there would be no prime mover, and consequently nothing would be moved. It is necessary to arrive at a prime unmoved mover, which Aristotle understood to be God. It was the identification of an external source of a spontaneous motion in the universe with God that was supposed to explain the first impulse given to matter, as well as its subsequent motion. Aristotle's natural theology exercised him a powerful influence on Thomas Aquinas, and through him on Christian theism. Aquinas gave 5 demonstrations for the existence of God, but he regarded the proof ex motu as the clearest one, and Aquinas preferred it to others. Ex motu apparently means from motion. So let me repeat that sentence, knowing what I know now. Aquinas gave 5 demonstrations for the existence of God, but he regarded the proof ex motu as the clearest one and preferred it to the others. The Aristotelian, what am I saying? Footnote, see F.C. Copplestone Aquinas. The Aristotelian view of the connection between cosmology and theology was later restated by Descartes, to whom it seemed manifest that God himself created matter along with motion and rest, and that he continued to preserve the quantity of motion which he originally imparted to the universe. Footnote, Descartes, Principia Philosophia. End footnote. Locke, whose philosophy deeply affected the development of materialism, was as empathetic as Descartes about the relationship between matter, motion, and God. Quote, matter, by matter's own strength cannot produce in itself so much as motion. The motion it has must also be from eternity, or else produced and added in spite of some other being more powerful than matter. End quote. Locke, an essay concerning human understanding, Book 4, Chapter 10. In spite of Kant's penetrating analysis of the proofs of the existence of God, the Aristotelian argument ex motu, which again means from motion, has frequently been reproduced in one form or another, and the Aristotelian argument ex motu, its distant echo, can still be heard today. Footnote. See, for example, the debate between Bertrand Russell and Father F.C. Copplestone and Bertrand Russell, Why I am not a Christian. End footnote. Aristotle's identification of the prime mover and God admitted, however, another interpretation. Quote, when theology assumes the existence of God, who imparts movement to and remains distinct from nature, end quote, wrote Holbach, quote, it only personifies the principle of mobility inherent in nature, end quote. Holbach, Système de la Nature. In other words, it is the inability of science to explain the origins of motion that gives theology the chance to claim the existence of God. Conversely, a contemporary physicist and philosopher puts it, quote, if nature were self-moving, God would be supernumerary, end quote. Mbunga, from, I guess, his book, Causality. I'm assuming it's a man. I guess I shouldn't. Or I shouldn't. Not I guess. I know I shouldn't. A cosmological system which includes the principle of self-creativeness is independent of any first cause or prime mover. In Lenin's opinion, Engels did not refute conclusively the possibility of motion being imparted to matter by an external source, that is, by God. Thus the door leading to the acceptance of a divine principle present in the world was still left open. Engels showed only that matter and motion were in fact inseparable, that the state of rest was relative, and that motion was absolute and without exception. However, on the basis of his argument, it was impossible to establish the conclusion that there was a necessary relation between matter and motion, and that material objects could not be motionless, because this was incompatible with the essence and laws of nature. In other words, Engels failed to provide a satisfactory solution to the problem of the origin of motion because he failed to discover its necessary ground, a self-explanatory principle which affords a sufficient reason for the existence and preservation of motion. With Hegel's help, Lenin proceeded to accomplish what Engels had left undone. Lenin could have said in defense of his procedure that since we have a unique universe to describe, the classical inductive approach to cosmology was ruled out. Footnote: an object is unique if and only if there is at least one and at most one entity of its kind in existence. End footnote. Every cosmological problem admits one and only one solution, therefore. The quote, logical, end quote, Hegelian method was the only suitable one. Lenin believed that the law of the unity and struggle of opposites enabled Lenin to attain the end which Engels had not achieved. The inherent contradictoriness of all things and phenomena is the source of all self-movement of matter and constantly generates its internal motive force and creative power. This results in revolutionary advance and in the emergence of more and more perfect forms of organized matter. The law of the unity and struggle of opposites provides conclusive demonstration that a creator and ruler of the universe who stands outside and above nature is superfluous. If nature is self-moving and everything in the world has an activity of its own, which takes place from within, in conformity to the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, there is no longer any need for the supernatural source of motion. Dialectical Materialism establishes conclusively the proof of atheism: the world can do without God. Footnote: Lenin has been praised for this piece of speculative philosophy up to today even by enlightened Marxist-Leninists. See, for example, Adam Schaff in some piece in Polish. And footnote: when we raise the question as to the existence of God, we are not asking a scientific question to which a scientific answer can be found. Holbach fully recognized and exploited this fact in his polemics against natural theology. Holbach argued that God is not an object of empirical knowledge, therefore we cannot have an idea of God, quote, Dieu est incomprehensible, end quote. Which means
Dieu est incompréhensible. Dieu est incompréhensible.
Dieu est incompréhensible.
Dieu est incompréhensible. Dieu est incompréhensible.
Dieu est incomprehensible. God is incomprehensible. Therefore, we cannot have an idea of God. Dieu est comprehensible. Or compréhensible. Let me see if I can listen again.
Dieu est incompréhensible.
Okay. I don't know if I said that right, but oh well. And that quote's from Holbach, Système de la Nature, Book 2, or Tome 2. It is indeed extremely difficult, if not altogether impossible, to make comprehensible in words something that in principle is not accessible to observation. When Lenin substituted for the quotation, quote, does God exist, end quote, another, quote, what is the origin of motion, end quote, which in his opinion was equivalent to the former, he was convinced that he was formulating a meaningful question and raising a scientific problem, one capable of scientific solution. Lenin was inclined to adopt this position because of the view that Lenin held about the nature and task of scientific knowledge and which is known as methodological essentialism. Footnote. For the definition of methodological essentialism and of ultimate explanation, see Popper Open Society and Popper Conjectures and Refutations. Today it is widely accepted that the aim of science is to provide a description of natural phenomena as complete and simple as possible. But an essentialist sees his task differently. The essentialist believes that science and philosophy should penetrate to the essential nature of things and reveal their hidden reality. For an essentialist, science does not consist in providing descriptions, but in giving ultimate explanations. An explanation is ultimate if by its very nature, it cannot be further explained and is in no need of any further explanation. Descartes' definition of matter is in its essence extension, and of mind is in its essence thinking substance, are essential definitions intended to provide ultimate explanations of any events in which either matter or mind are involved. The term, quote, essentialism, end quote, fits Lenin's approach like a glove. To explain capitalism is to discover capitalism's essence, that is, the laws of capitalism's development, which reveal the necessity of the disappearance of capitalism and capitalism's replacement by socialism. Footnote. See Lenin's The Three Sources and Three Component Parts of Marxism. End footnote. To answer the question, quote, what is motion, end quote, is to provide the true definition of motion, i.e. to give the essential characteristics of the definiendum from which other characteristics necessarily flow. Definiendum means to be defined. So to answer the question, quote, what is motion, end quote, is to provide the true definition of motion, i.e. to give the essential characteristics of the definiendum I guess which means in this context would mean the definition from which other characteristics necessarily flow. When Lenin affirmed that the law of unity of opposites explains the origin of motion, Lenin did not mean an explanation which would consist in showing by logical inference and empirical test how the known laws operate to produce a given occurrence, but an ultimate explanation which discloses the, quote, true and, quote, inner essence of motion. Lenin clearly believed that hidden essences of things are accessible to human knowledge and that the, quote, essential nature, end quote, of motion can be discovered. The proposition that the, quote, true and, quote, inner essence of motion is the unity and struggle of opposites is open to the objection that it regards natural phenomenon anthropomorphically. To derive the natural phenomena of change and motion from contradiction, that is, from a logical relation, is to misrepresent each of them and to conceive their relationship in terms applicable to neither. How can an internal contradiction be a, quote, actual force, end quote, and a cause of motion? Contradiction is a logical relation, motion a physical process. Causal relations and logical relations apply to objects of a different sort. If an object can be either cause or effect, it cannot be a term of a logical relation. While a proposition may contradict or entail another proposition, propositions cannot either make or fail to make something happen. An idealist like Hegel could reduce physical and causal relationships to logical categories. A materialist who considers material objects as primary and concepts as a product of man's activity derived from the experience of material objects is barred from following in Hegel's footsteps. The thesis that contradiction objectively present in things and phenomena are the origin of motion origin of motion is inconsistent with the basic premise of materialism, quote, nothing but matter exists, end quote. Lenin spoke of the internal contradictions in the phenomena of nature as the source of their, quote, spontaneous, end quote, change, and as that characteristic of matter which makes self-generation of motion incomprehensible. He pursued this object in order to establish a view of the universe that would do without a supernatural force or source of creative energy, one that would reveal nothing of the existence and operation of God and nature, and leave no room for natural theology. Irrespective of whether we do or do not sympathize with Lenin's endeavor, it should be recognized that Lenin's solution of the problem lacks adequate and scientifically satisfactory justification. A cause which is a cause of itself is a theological and metaphysical concept comparable, as has been mentioned earlier, with Aristotle's prime mover and ultimate cause, or with God who is, quote, the hand of himself, end quote. The methods of empirical science and of physics in particular are not suited to the search for any ultimate and final cause such as Lenin was searching for. A physicist always has to stop somewhere in his search for causes, but a physicist assumes the validity of unending series of causal relationships. Therefore, the physicist never accepts anything as being a cause of itself or a self-causing energy. Irrespective of whether Lenin's concept of self-generation, internal motion, or matter does or does not lead to certain socially desirable consequences, the concept itself lacks scientific credentials, is incompatible with the methodology of natural science, and with the assumptions of naturalism and materialism. In Lenin's search for the origin and essence of motion, Lenin made use of some familiar theological conceptions and ascribed to matter some attributes similar to those which religious thinkers have associated with the spirit and theologians with the transcendent God. Nicholas Berdyaev said of Lenin and Soviet philosophers in general that they turned materialism towards, quote, a peculiar sort of idealism and spiritualism, end quote, and bestowed upon nature divine attributes. Footnote. Berdyaev, who, like everybody else, regarded Marx as the founder of dialectical materialism, made Marx responsible for having, quote, transferred the nature of thought and spirit to matter, end quote. End footnote. Enno Losky. Let's see if there's anything for this guy. Nikolai Losky lived from 1870 to 1965, also known as Enno Losky, was a Russian philosopher representative of Russian idealism, intuitionist epistemology, personalism, libertarianism, ethics, and axiology, parenthesis, value theory, end parenthesis. Losky gave his philosophical system the name intuitive personalism. Born in Latvia, Losky spent his working life in St. Petersburg, New York, and Paris. He was the father of the influential Christian theologian Vladimir Losky. Back to the text. Enno Losky himself, a metaphysical and religious philosopher, spoke in the same vein. Enno Losky wrote that Lenin endowed the primary reality so richly with qualities and faculties that Lenin no longer had any right to call it matter without doing violence to logic and traditional philosophical terminology. Footnote. See Enno Losky, The History of Russian Philosophy. End footnote. It's hard to disagree with this opinion. As Lenin conceived it, matter is endowed with the power of spontaneous internal motion, capable of producing a reflection of itself, creative of novelty and purposeful in its accomplishments. The spontaneous internal motion of matter, both a blind force and a purposeful agent, results from internal and corporeal contradictions. These contradictory characteristics and conflicting tendencies struggle with each other and give rise not only to change but also to an inevitable progress. In conformity to its intrinsic laws, this self-moving nature produces higher and higher realms of being, each of which is subject to specific laws irreducible to the laws of the lower level of advance. Evolution is creative. evolution's imminent impetus is apparent in the constant ascent of the stages of development. In general, the blind forces of nature operate with the Spencerian benevolent necessity and are productive of ever higher degrees of perfection. Like the Stoics, and also perhaps like Spinoza, Lenin wished to be a thoroughgoing materialist, but he attributed to matter some of the characteristics of a deity. The Stoics and Spinoza called their spiritualized universe des siva natura, either God or nature. Yeah, let's see how we pronounce that.
Deus sive natura. Deus sive natura. Deus sive natura.
Deus sive natura. The Stoics and Spinoza called their spiritualized universe des sive natura, either God or nature. Lenin called it, quote, matter, end quote. While trying to show that nature had no need of a creator, Lenin was driven by the logic of his speculative premises to a conclusion which identified the creator with the creator's creation and made, quote, matter, end quote, suitable for, quote, God. Without knowing it and certainly without wishing it, Lenin came close to the position whose intellectual foundations are to be found in Samuel Alexander, and which is known as naturalistic theism. According to Wikipedia, Samuel Alexander lived from 1859 to 1938. Samuel Alexander was an Australian-born British philosopher. Samuel Alexander was the first Jewish fellow of an Oxbridge college. Samuel Alexander is best known as an advocate of emergentism in biology. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, Australian-born philosopher Samuel Alexander, who lived from 1859 to 1938, was a prominent figure in early 20th century British philosophy. Samuel Alexander is best known for advancing, quote, British emergentism, end quote, a movement that held mind, quote, emerges, end quote, from matter. Alexander rejected idealism and accordingly can be labeled as a, quote, new realist, end quote, alongside the likes of Bertrand Russell. However, unlike other new realists, Alexander maintained close ties with British idealism throughout his career, and his ontology arguably bears similarities to the absolute idealism of F.H. Bradley. Samuel Alexander's mature metaphysical system is set out in his greatest work, Space, Time, and Deity, published in 1920. Samuel Alexander conceives the world as a hierarchy of levels. Space and time sit at the lowest level, and through a process of emergence give rise to the levels of matter, life, mind, and deity. These levels are pervaded by, quote, categorical, end quote, features of reality such as substance, universals, and causality. Although Alexander is primarily known as a metaphysician, Alexander wrote extensively on many other philosophical topics, including the history of philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of religion. Alexander spent most of his professional career at the University of Manchester, where he supported various moves in education and feminism. On his death, Alexander left his philosophical papers and correspondence to the John Rylands Library at Manchester, and his collection constitutes an important philosophic archive of the period. Alexander's work was widely celebrated during his lifetime. G.H. Muirhead wrote that after Bradley's death in 1924, Alexander was, quote, the leading figure in British philosophy in whom all schools, whatever their differences, were delayed to honor as their chief, end quote. John Laird described Space, Time, and Deity as, quote, the boldest adventure in detailed speculative metaphysics, end quote, since Hobbes. Although Samuel Alexander never founded a school of philosophy, Samuel Alexander is credited with having an influence on figures as diverse as new realists such as Laird, C.D. Broad, and Edwin B. Holt, the process philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, John Anderson, quote, father of Australian philosophy, end quote, and his school at Sydney, British idealist May Sinclair and Hilda Oakley, and philosopher of history R.G. Collingwood. A number of studies were produced on Samuel Alexander's work in the mid-20th century, but it then saw a period of neglect. Over the last decade or so, interest has increased, as indicated by Fisher's (2021) collection, marking the centenary of Samuel Alexander's Space, Time, and Deity. Back to the text. Without knowing it, and certainly without wishing it, Lenin came close to the position whose intellectual foundations are to be found in Samuel Alexander, which is known as naturalistic theism. Naturalistic theism shares the belief in cosmic purposes, although the purpose is revealed by a kind of blind impulsion rather than by a kind of creative force. For Samuel Alexander, deity is a quality of existence beyond mind, related to mind in a way similar to that in which mind is related to life or life to matter. Deity has no distinctive characteristics, but is that to which the world strives or tends. Deity is not a creator of the universe, but is itself created by the entire evolutionary process. If Alexander's deity is understood to mean the emergence of higher and higher integrative levels, rising in complexity and organization, and in virtue of which the world is continually growing richer in content and more perfect in value, there is no sharp line dividing Alexander's deity and Lenin's matter. Footnote. The close resemblance between naturalistic theism and certain interpretations of dialectical materialism is the subject of J. Needham's Herbert Spencer lecture at Oxford University, published as J. Needham's Time, the Refreshing River. End footnote. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.